Philip II of Spain, who ruled from 1556 to 1598, inherited the largest empire in human history to that point, an empire that literally circled the globe, spanning the Americas from California to Chile, the Philippines and various Pacific islands, much of Italy, the Netherlands, parts of North Africa, and the Iberian Peninsula itself. An empire on which the sun never set decades before that phrase would be applied to the British, and this empire controlled the richest silver mines ever discovered, the Potosí mountain in present-day Bolivia that produced over 40,000 tons of silver during Philip's reign, more precious metal wealth than any previous ruler had ever possessed. And beyond silver there was gold from Mexico and Peru, sugar from the Caribbean, spices from the East Indies, trade goods flowing from every corner of the known world into Spanish coffers. And yet Philip II declared bankruptcy 4 times during his 42-year reign, in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596, and when he died in 1598, the Spanish crown was so deeply in debt that his successor inherited an empire that was financially broken, unable to pay its soldiers or creditors, facing revolts and defections, beginning the long decline that would reduce Spain from global superpower to European backwater within a century. And understanding how Philip managed to bankrupt himself despite owning half the world reveals fundamental truths about imperial finance, about the relationship between resources and power, about inflation and debt and the limits of precious metal wealth, and about how even unlimited income can be consumed by unlimited expenditure, making Philip II's reign one of history's greatest cautionary tales about the difference between wealth and solvency, between owning assets and managing cash flow, between military ambition and fiscal reality. The inheritance Philip received in 1556 when his father Charles V abdicated was staggering in extent, but already financially troubled. Charles had spent his reign fighting wars on multiple fronts, against the French, against the Ottoman Empire, against Protestant princes in Germany, and these wars had cost far more than the empire's revenues could cover. Charles had borrowed extensively from German and Italian bankers, particularly the Fuggers, and he passed these debts to Philip along with the empire. So Philip started his reign already heavily indebted, owing approximately 36 million ducats, roughly 6 times the annual revenues of the Spanish crown, and the debt service alone consumed about 2/3 of revenue, leaving little for actual governance or military spending. And Philip's first bankruptcy in 1557, less than a year after taking power, was essentially a technical default, a conversion of short-term debts to long-term bonds at reduced interest rates, forced on creditors, who had no choice but to accept because the alternative was complete default and losing everything. And this set the pattern for Philip's reign, borrowing to cover current expenses, defaulting when debts became unsustainable, renegotiating with creditors, borrowing again, repeating the cycle every decade or so, each bankruptcy causing temporary financial chaos, but then allowing new borrowing as creditors, having no alternative, continued to lend in hopes of eventually being repaid. The silver flowing from America was supposed to solve everything. The treasure fleets that arrived annually from the New World carried such enormous quantities of silver that it seemed impossible Spain could ever run out of money. In the 1590s, annual silver imports averaged around 200,000 kilograms, worth roughly 10 million ducats, an enormous sum that dwarfed the revenues of any other European state. But this silver was already spent before it arrived. Philip had borrowed against future silver shipments, pledging several years of American revenue in advance to secure loans for current wars, and the actual amount of silver that reached the Spanish treasury was a fraction of what was mined, because much of it never left America, was spent there on administration and garrisons, much was lost to pirates and shipwrecks, much was smuggled to avoid taxes, and of what did arrive in Spain, most was immediately seized by creditors to service debt. So the paradox was that the more silver Spain received, the deeper into debt it fell, because the silver enabled more borrowing, and Philip used that borrowing capacity to fund military campaigns that cost more than the silver was worth, creating a debt spiral where increasing revenue led to increasing debt rather than to solvency. The expenditures were driven by Philip's strategic goals, which were essentially impossible. He wanted to maintain Catholic dominance in Europe against Protestant challenges, wanted to suppress the Dutch revolt in the Netherlands, wanted to defend against Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean, wanted to invade England and restore Catholicism there, wanted to maintain Spanish control over Italy and defend against French encroachment, and wanted to protect and expand the empire in the Americas and Asia. These goals were individually expensive and collectively unaffordable. The Dutch revolt alone cost Spain perhaps 250 million ducats over the 40 years of fighting, far more than all the silver imported from America during the same period. The Armada sent against England in 1588 cost 10 million ducats and achieved nothing except the loss of most of the fleet. Wars in Italy and France consumed tens of millions more, and the garrisons and navies needed to defend the global empire were standing expenses that continued regardless of whether wars were active. So Philip was trying to do militarily what no empire had ever attempted: maintain dominance across multiple continents simultaneously against multiple enemies. And the costs of this ambition exceeded even the enormous revenues of the Spanish Empire. No amount of silver could fund unlimited wars on all fronts indefinitely. The structural problem was that while Spain had enormous gross revenues, its net revenues after expenses were small. The empire was expensive to administer and defend. Colonies required governors and soldiers and bureaucrats, all of whom needed to be paid. Shipping needed protection from pirates and rival powers, requiring expensive navies. The distances involved meant that responding to threats was slow and costly. Troops and supplies had to be moved thousands of miles, and the Spanish crown had inherited a system where much of the revenue was committed to hereditary obligations. Noble families had titles and privileges that included fixed incomes from crown lands. Church had its share of revenues, local governments had their taxes, and by the time all these prior claims were satisfied, the actual revenue available to the crown was perhaps a third of gross revenue. So while total imperial revenue might be 15 million ducats annually, the crown's disposable income was more like 5 million. And this wasn't enough to fund the wars Philip wanted to fight. So he borrowed, and borrowing at the interest rates he had to pay, typically 14 to 18% to reflect the high risk of lending to a serial defaulter, meant that debt service quickly consumed most of the disposable revenue, creating the need for more borrowing, and the cycle was unsustainable. Simple mathematics showed it would end in bankruptcy. But Philip kept borrowing anyway because the alternative was abandoning his strategic goals, and those goals were non-negotiable for him. They were matters of religious duty and dynastic honor, not just policy choices that could be adjusted for financial reality. The inflation caused by American silver was another factor that undermined Philip's finances. The massive influx of silver into Europe caused the price revolution, a sustained inflation lasting from roughly 1520 to 1650, where prices increased several-fold. This happened because the quantity of goods available didn't increase as fast as the quantity of silver. So more silver was chasing the same amount of goods, driving prices up, and Spain, as the entry point for American silver, experienced this inflation first and most severely. By the end of Philip's reign, prices in Spain had roughly quadrupled compared to the beginning of the century, and this inflation destroyed the real value of fixed revenues. Rents and taxes that had been set at specific amounts in silver became worth less and less as silver's purchasing power declined. So even as the crown received more silver nominally, it could buy less with it. And meanwhile, the costs of everything, soldiers' pay, food, weapons, ships, all increased with inflation. So Spain's financial position deteriorated even as silver imports increased. The silver was being debased by its own abundance, and Philip's government understood this but couldn't stop it. The silver imports were essential to borrowing capacity. Creditors would lend against future silver shipments. So stopping the imports would have meant stopping borrowing, which would have meant stopping the wars, which was unacceptable. The creditors who lent to Philip were primarily Genoese bankers, who had replaced the Fuggers and other German bankers as Spain's main financiers after Charles V's reign. And these Genoese had developed sophisticated techniques for lending to sovereigns. They would form syndicates to spread risk, would demand collateral in the form of future silver shipments or tax revenues, would charge interest through disguised mechanisms to avoid usury prohibitions, and they made enormous profits from lending to Spain despite the repeated bankruptcies, because Spanish debt, while risky, paid high returns, and because the Genoese had monopoly on lending to Spain, they could dictate terms, And after each bankruptcy, they'd negotiate settlements that gave them long-term bonds paying modest interest, which they'd then sell to other investors at a discount, recovering their capital and passing the risk to others. So the Genoese bankers as a class profited from Spain's debt, even though individual lenders sometimes lost fortunes, and this created perverse incentives. The bankers benefited from Spain's chronic insolvency because it kept interest rates high. If Spain had been a reliable borrower, rates would have fallen and profits declined. So the bankers had little incentive to encourage fiscal responsibility, and Philip had no alternative creditors. The Genoese monopoly meant he had to accept their terms or stop borrowing, and stopping borrowing meant losing wars, so the relationship continued despite being exploitative. The human costs of Philip's financial mismanagement were severe. Soldiers went unpaid for months or years, leading to mutinies. The Spanish army of Flanders mutinied repeatedly, sacking cities to pay themselves when wages didn't arrive. This undermined military effectiveness and created atrocities that turned populations against Spain, making the Dutch revolt impossible to suppress. Spanish subjects faced heavy taxation. The alcabala sales tax was increased multiple times, falling primarily on common people while nobles were exempt. This taxation suppressed economic activity, made Spain less competitive commercially compared to England and the Netherlands, which had lower tax burdens, and the inflation caused by silver imports hurt ordinary Spaniards who saw their purchasing power decline, while the crown spent the silver on foreign wars that didn't benefit them. So Philip's reign, despite the American silver, was experienced by most Spaniards as economic hardship in the long term. Effects were even worse. The wars drained Spain of manpower. Young men were conscripted and sent to die in Flanders or France or against the Ottomans, depopulating Spanish towns and villages, and the economic distortions created by silver imports prevented development of domestic industry. Why manufacture goods when you could import them with silver? So Spain became dependent on foreign manufacturers, particularly from England and Holland, and when the silver eventually ran out, Spain had no industrial base to fall back on, had deindustrialized while living on American treasure, setting up the long decline of the 17th century. The comparison to other empires is instructive. The British Empire a few centuries later would be much more fiscally responsible, would develop a sophisticated system of public finance through the Bank of England and the national debt, would generally avoid strategic overextension, and would last much longer than Spain's moment of dominance. This wasn't because Britain was inherently superior, but because British leaders learned from Spain's mistakes, understood that empire required financial sustainability, that military power had to be matched to fiscal capacity, and that borrowing had to be managed rather than abused. The Dutch Republic, Spain's rebellious subjects, would also demonstrate superior fiscal management. They developed a system where the state could borrow at much lower interest rates than Spain could, around 4 to 5% versus Spain's 14 to 18%. Because Dutch institutions gave creditors confidence that debts would be repaid, this lower cost of borrowing gave the Dutch fiscal capacity to fight Spain despite being much smaller and poorer. They could sustain war longer because they could borrow more efficiently. So Philip's financial failures weren't inevitable, weren't just the result of bad luck or impossible circumstances. They reflected policy choices and institutional weaknesses that could have been addressed but weren't. The question of what Philip should have done differently is complex. The obvious answer is he should have spent less, should have abandoned some of his strategic goals, prioritized which wars to fight and which to concede. But this was psychologically and politically nearly impossible for him. Philip saw himself as defender of Catholicism, saw the Protestant Reformation and Ottoman expansion as existential threats that had to be opposed everywhere simultaneously, and he saw dynastic honor as requiring defense of Spanish possessions and interests wherever challenged. So scaling back would have meant abandoning core identity and purpose, would have meant accepting that Spain couldn't do what Philip believed God had called it to do, and this was unthinkable for him. He would rather bankrupt the empire than accept strategic retreat. And this psychological inability to match ambitions to resources is common among imperial leaders. You don't build empires by being cautious and accepting limitations, you build them by overreaching and usually getting away with it. But eventually the overreach catches up, and Philip's reign was that moment for Spain, when ambition finally exceeded capacity catastrophically. leaving the empire financially broken and beginning its long decline. The legacy of Philip's bankruptcies extended far beyond his reign. The debt he accumulated couldn't be repaid. His successors inherited crushing obligations that constrained their freedom of action, forced them to continue the cycle of borrowing and defaulting, and gradually creditors lost confidence in Spanish debt. Interest rates rose higher. Borrowing became more difficult and expensive, and eventually Spain lost access to credit markets altogether. By the mid-17th century, Spain was essentially shut out of international finance, couldn't borrow except at extortionate rates, and this financial isolation coincided with military decline. Spanish armies that had dominated Europe for a century began losing consistently. The Dutch achieved independence, Portugal revolted and regained independence, France surpassed Spain as the dominant continental power, and Spain's economy stagnated. The silver imports declined as mines were exhausted, and as Spain lost control of shipping routes to pirates and rivals. And without silver and without credit, Spain couldn't fund the military that had maintained its empire. So the empire fragmented, territories were lost, and Spain became a second-rate power, and this decline was directly traceable to Philip's financial mismanagement, his accumulation of debts that couldn't be serviced, his repeated bankruptcies that destroyed Spain's creditworthiness, his inflation of the currency through silver imports that undermined Spain's economy. All of these created conditions where decline was inevitable. The question was only how fast it would happen. The irony is that Philip died believing he had been a successful ruler. He had maintained Catholicism in most of his domains, had prevented Protestant takeover of Europe, had defended against the Ottomans, had preserved the empire for his successor, and he saw the financial problems as temporary difficulties that Providence would resolve, never fully grasping that his policies had created structural insolvency, that the empire couldn't sustain the wars he'd fought, that the bankruptcies weren't just bad luck, but inevitable consequences of his choices. And this self-deception is common among leaders who confuse controlling resources with fiscal sustainability, who think that owning wealth is the same as being solvent. Philip owned half the world but died bankrupt because he confused assets with liquidity, confused gross revenue with disposable income, confused the ability to borrow with the ability to repay. And these confusions destroyed Spain's fiscal position despite its enormous wealth, proving that you can own everything and still go broke if you spend more than you have. And that lesson, which Philip failed to learn, remains relevant. Governments and individuals still confuse assets with solvency, still borrow against future income to fund current consumption, still assume that resources will always be available to service debts, and still go bankrupt despite owning substantial assets. Because ultimately solvency is about cash flow, about matching income to expenses. And Philip's reign is history's most spectacular example of cash flow and solvency despite enormous asset wealth. The king who owned half the world but died bankrupt, leaving an empire that was financially ruined, militarily overstretched, economically distorted, and beginning the long decline from global superpower to European backwater, all because he couldn't or wouldn't match his expenditures to his revenues, couldn't accept that even unlimited silver from America wasn't enough to fund unlimited wars on all fronts, and couldn't learn from his first bankruptcy or his second or his third that the path he was on was unsustainable, kept borrowing and spending and defaulting in a pattern that eventually destroyed Spanish power, making Philip II simultaneously one of history's most powerful and most financially incompetent rulers, who squandered the greatest inheritance any monarch ever received and left his successors with debts they could never repay and a legacy of decline they could never reverse, and whose reign stands as permanent warning that owning resources doesn't guarantee power if you can't manage the finances, that wealth and solvency are different things, and that unlimited ambition with limited fiscal capacity is a recipe for bankruptcy no matter how much silver you control.